Could Bitcoin fall out of the logarithmic regression channel? What seemed not long ago like an outrageous idea seems not so far-fetched anymore, now that Bitcoin is struggling to get even above $20,000 again. So could Bitcoin fall out of our long-term logarithmic regression channel that we have been using here for quite a while on this channel, and for example just start doing weird stuff that we don't expect? Could this actually happen, friends? Now before we start, let's just zoom in and again realize how disappointing Bitcoin again performs, as almost every day now since weeks. And Bitcoin is still doing this weird thing here. At least the support seems to be holding. It is either in some kind of ascending triangle structure or in a kind of ascending trend, which is of course not so good because this would be a bear flag, or in a kind of ascending triangle structure. And I still hope that this will break to the upside. Why? Because currently the dollar index is pumping as always like a crazy freaking maniac, okay? The dollar index is out of control, and so this of course means that Bitcoin sees a lot of brutal pressure, because every time the dollar goes up, Bitcoin goes down. But the dollar has been pumping relentlessly for, I would say, like a year now without pause. And so this has to correct sooner or later, okay? Because this is a perfect parabola. Look at this. I mean, this is a perfect parabola, and we all know how parabolas end, right? We all know how they end. Sooner or later, there will come a brutal type of correction, but of course, we don't know when. Will it come already quite soon? Or will the dollar index still pump for quite a few more weeks or even months until then a bigger correction comes? Now this is of course almost impossible to find out. We will just have to hope that the dollar doesn't pump so much anymore. But if it does, if we look at past super cycles, okay, if we just take the last super cycle of the dollar from the 90s, where it really pumped from 80 to 120, okay, and we overlay this here, we first of all see that there is some kind of similarity in the structure, right? If we overlay this whole structure here, we see, doesn't look so unsimilar here. So we could identify this thing here, this rise, with what happened in the 90s, right? So this would mean that right now it's pumping, which it also did in the 90s in a very similar form. And then we got this correction here, right? So where we got this correction, and this would speak for that we get a correction soon. But of course, then later the dollar still could continue pumping for many more years, of course, with intermediate corrections. But nonetheless, this will of course put brutal pressure on Bitcoin, and Bitcoin could only rise a bit when there are these intermediate dumps. You know, when there are these intermediate dumps, Bitcoin could see some relaxation and could rise. But apart from that, Bitcoin would be under insane pressure if the dollar index would really go back to values of 120 or even 130. Now, meanwhile, the euro is falling to insanely low values. Is it already at below parity? No, it actually exactly hit 1.00023 incredibly. So just exactly at the 1.0 support, it seems to now be bouncing, but of course, we don't know yet. I strongly suspect this structure still looks to me like a bottoming structure, but of course there's no guarantee that this will really be a bottoming structure and that this is going to happen. And of course the Euro USD is super inversely correlated to the dollar index, because the euro flows with 57% weight into the calculation of the dollar index. So basically the Euro USD chart is almost an inverted mirror image of the DXY chart. Now, I strongly suspect that is a classical buy the rumor, sell the news, because tomorrow the CPI data will be released. We will talk about it extensively. That is an important thing. The CPI data is super important for the Fed, because upon that data, they will decide how much and how aggressively they will continue to raise the interest rates. And we all know that high interest rates are not good for stocks. And since Bitcoin has become a ridiculous puppet of the stock market, Bitcoin is following stocks all the time. So therefore, of course, if the Fed would aggressively continue to raise the interest rates, that of course would not be so amazing for Bitcoin. So we want to talk now about some kind of worst case scenario situation where we contemplate the possibility if Bitcoin could fall out of this logarithmic long-term channel, which it has respected. It has respected since 2010, okay? So it's rising in the logarithmic channel. So of the form, the y-axis, okay, y is some form of logarithm, a times x plus b. That is like a normal logarithmic function. But of course, why is it still curved? Because only the y-axis is logarithmic, okay? The x-axis is not logarithmic. If the x-axis would also be in logarithmic mode, this thing here would actually be a perfect line, okay? A perfect line. Now, depending on how we choose the parameters a and b, these are the fitting parameters, we get different slopes, like different curvatures for this long-term logarithmic channel. And if we load, for example, the old logarithmic growth channel, okay, that has been, I don't know, some guy on TradingView did it, okay? So the long-term logarithmic trend channel from the earlier days. You see it fits quite nicely, right? Look at this. In 2010, amazing. 2013, wow, nice. Here perfectly the support line, even at the low, wicks down below the support line, but is perfectly pushed back, and this line here acts as support. Very beautiful. Goes to the top of this line here, the resistance line. Amazing. Even here perfect. But now what's happening? The first major breakout. Strange. Okay, let's continue. Wow. Okay. So now it's already brutally out of this long-term logarithmic trend channel. Now why? Because this long-term logarithmic trend channel was an optimistic one where the fitting parameters a and b that I draw before were such that the inclination is pretty high. The inclination of this channel, as you can see, is pretty high because in the year 2028 we would have already had values of around $2.5 million, okay? So this was a very optimistic long-term logarithmic channel. So now we take a pessimistic one. The most pessimistic which I'm using is the one where we actually say that here this thing was actually the real top, and so we take it fully into account and say that this is now the new resistance line, okay? That this is now the resistance slope of the long-term logarithmic channel, a valid one, okay? And then, of course, this consequently means that the lower slope is, of course, also lower than in the case that we saw before. So we see that here, for example, the crash of March 2020 is fully within the channel. And here we are still firmly within the channel. So this logarithmic channel here is a lot more conservative than the one we saw before. However, does that mean that Bitcoin will certainly stay within the bounds of this channel? Well, we saw in the case of the channel before, for 7 years it worked well, and then for the first time in the March 2020 low, so after 10 years it broke to the downside, and now it really broke brutally to the downside in this latest dump. So that of course means that the fitting parameters can be chosen again should this channel break, okay? So for example now, if Bitcoin would start doing something like this and would go into an even slower rise, right? Then of course we would have to accordingly fit Bitcoin anew, right? And I'm just drawing this now using curves, but you know what I'm hinting at, okay? So this is not super precise mathematical model. I'm just trying to draw what we could do then. So of course, this whole thing then would be fitted anew, right? With the new fitting parameters A and B, and then we would get some kind of different logarithmic growth model. It would be still some kind of logarithmic growth model, right? If you look at this, still okay, long term still rising, but of course rising slower. So the logarithmic channels that we see and that you have probably seen on different websites or different YouTubers using it, they all have some kind of certain fitting parameters, and you can choose those fitting parameters however you like. You can choose pessimistic fitting parameters or optimistic fitting parameters. So if of course now we go back to our pessimistic logarithmic channel that we have said is a pessimistic one, you see that actually we could of course go outside of this channel. There's nothing preventing us. For example, if Bitcoin adoption is now slower than we thought, and if the dollar index goes into this mega cycle that I have drawn before, which of course means that risk assets will perform worse, so the stock market will perform worse, and of course consequently Bitcoin, that of course could mean that we might see suppressed performance of Bitcoin for quite a few years. But that doesn't mean that the logarithmic regression model is dead. It would just mean that we have to switch to an even more pessimistic one. Okay, that was the pessimistic one, so we might have to switch to an even more pessimistic one, where we then say, okay, this is rising a lot slower than we thought, but it's still rising. This is of course now very rough, okay? I'm not doing any mathematical stuff here, but just for visualization purposes. So I mean, we could still reach like $650,000 in 2033, 34, okay? It's still not super bad. So in 12 years, Bitcoin would still be 30 times higher than it is now. It's of course not as fast as we would have liked, but this doesn't mean that the logarithmic model would be wrong. It just means that we overestimated the fitting parameters of the logarithmic model A and B. We overestimated them. We would have liked it to be a very steep channel, right? We would have liked it to be a steep channel, but it just chose to not grow so fast. Why? Because Bitcoin adoption ultimately is not as fast as we would like. Because if we go, for example, to Glassnode or blockchain.info, many other sites also have this, and we look at how many unique addresses are actually used in the Bitcoin blockchain, okay? We see that it rose really fast. The orange line are the unique addresses. It rose extremely fast until about late 2017, okay? Until the peak in late 2017 at $20,000. But what happened then? It went into a slower gear. I will slow down a bit and just grow in a more relaxed manner. And we indeed see that, sure, Bitcoin is still growing, the number of addresses is still growing, but we are still not consistently at the values that we had in late 2017. The number of active addresses is still at around 1 million, whereas in late 2017, we were at values of over 1 million, 1.2, 1.3 million, okay? So this means Bitcoin is just not being adopted as fast as we would have liked. Why is that? Well, we still are struggling, friends, and that is a bit brutal, to find an awesome use case for Bitcoin beside just hodling, and buying and hoping that it will be worth more in the future. Bitcoin is still struggling to offer us this amazing use case where you can use Bitcoin all the time, where you can go to the bakery or go repair your car at the mechanic and pay everything with Bitcoin. We're still waiting for that. We're still waiting for like pressing a button here on the smartphone, pressing a button and sending instant payments with Bitcoin. We are still waiting for such a killer application where every, even let's formulate it mildly, not every super technically learned person or super intelligent person can use Bitcoin easily. Bitcoin is still kind of complicated to use. It's still not easy with these long addresses, copy pasting, and then you have the online exchanges and they are not so super safe and you have to use hardware wallets, okay? So Bitcoin has still not managed to have a super easy and good use case. So it is rising slower than we would have liked. Therefore, it could very well be, friends, that we will go out of this logarithmic channel. There's no law, there's no thing preventing this, because we have seen that it happened for the even more optimistic channel, which I have shown you before. I mean, let's just load in again. Now it's a bit too many lines, but here we can see the three different channels. Like the one, the super optimistic one, it is ridiculous by now. It's completely out of the question, but in the early days, it didn't seem so unrealistic, right? So we can of course completely delete this one, but who's to say that this one will also prove too optimistic and that we will actually go out of this one and Bitcoin will stay around the $10,000 range now for a few years, as long as the dollar index keeps pumping to values of 120, 130, if the dollar index really does such a super cycle that I have drawn before, and if the stock market really goes into a longer stretched out bear market, and if we really get a recession like 2000, 2001, 2002 and so on, like after the dot-com bubble, it's not extremely unthinkable, okay friends? That's what I'm saying, it's not unthinkable. So we should keep in mind that those models, like all models that we have, are just that, models, okay? They are models. And every model can at some point be falsified. It's a model. Even in physics, you have models that sometimes which work fine for hundreds of years, and then suddenly you discover that there's actually an even better model, and that suddenly the model that you used for hundreds of years, bam, it suddenly doesn't work anymore in this one instance. You have to use it for this one case, bam, it doesn't work anymore. The model is invalidated. That's it. The model is invalidated. You need a better model. So we have to keep that in mind, friends. We have to keep that in mind. That's what I wanted to say with regards to logarithmic channels. And now going back one last time to Bitcoin to like kind of understand what it's doing right now, I still think that the dollar index will dump at some point. I mean, this is like ridiculous how it's been rising without any correction. So a correction in the dollar index will come, and I think at some point we will see some form of bounce, at the least some form of bounce. Okay, when it comes, I don't know exactly, or will it even dip lower, but there will be some form of bounce, because nothing just drops without any correction ever in the history of humanity. There have always been brutal bounces. So we're just waiting for the dollar index to stop pumping, or let's put it like this, if it does a mega cycle, to at least slow down for a while and correct for a bit, because it has been rising relentlessly for over a year now. So some form of correction in the dollar index at some point has to come. Okay, it has to come, because look at this, it's just a straight parabola. This is absolute insanity. So at some point there has to be a correction, of course, and when that happens, the Bitcoin bounce will come. Okay, it will come. It's only a matter of time. Friends, that's about what I wanted to say today about Bitcoin's long-term behavior. So of course, again, super disappointing, because Bitcoin could really drop out here and do kind of disappointing stuff for a long time. We should be mentally prepared for it. Even if I don't like it, you don't like it, nobody likes it, but we have to be prepared for such a scenario, friends. So thanks for watching. This was not even such a rant episode. It can still happen sometimes. It's not likely in these times now with the pathetic performance of Bitcoin, but I'm trying to sometimes still make videos where I don't rant so much, and we still will talk about mathematical models, of course, and Bitcoin's long-term behavior, because that is the most important thing, that we understand the long-term development of Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies. Thanks for watching, friends. If you found this video helpful, I would be glad if you would subscribe to this illustrious channel where I combine the art of ranting and of Bitcoin analysis into a wonderful package of ranting and Bitcoin analysis. Okay? That is my experiment, a Bitcoin rant channel that still tries to do good Bitcoin analysis. Then I wish you a nice day, stay safe, and see you in the next Bitcoin update video tomorrow. Ciao!